About 30 million people in the US suffer from eating disorders. And like I said, teens and 20-somethings usually are more so. But we've seen kids as young as 6 come into our office as old as 76. So it can be a much larger thing than people realize.
Welcome to the Exercise is Health podcast, where we're talking about exercise, health, and the interconnectedness of the two. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we will be coming to you every single week from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg. Hey, welcome back, everybody, to the Exercise is Health podcast. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie,
and we're coming to you from our studio, Muscle Activation Schaumburg in Schaumburg, Illinois. Now, at Muscle Activation Schaumburg, we believe your health is your most valuable asset. Your health is one of the biggest influencers of the quality and quantity of time that you have. And while there are many aspects of health, our expertise is exercise. Exercise has been proven time and again to not only improve your health, but also increase your longevity and improve your quality of life. But we know that exercise is not the only piece of the puzzle, and that is why we are bringing you a rock star guest today, none other than Meghan Reitz. Meghan takes a very proactive but objective approach to each client she works with, and will take time and practice the skills clients need to survive and be successful in the real world. Meghan has worked within the counseling profession for over 10 years. Her experience includes providing individual, couples, family, group, crisis, and substance abuse counseling. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Iowa in anthropology and psychology, and her graduate degree from Bradley University in human development and community counseling. Meghan, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really nice to see you guys and to be here.
Yeah, it is great to see you too. So why don't you kind of take us back to the beginning of when you were going through your educational journey and kind of what stemmed your interest in psychology and then into counseling from there?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll try to make it brief because it is kind of a long, winding story. So I've always been interested in human development and especially how the human brain operates and how people thrive, and then also too, just generally live and succeed. I actually was originally going to become an archaeologist, so that was my one major, and then I decided that I wanted to stem into psychology, really not only about helping people, but just the fascination of the biology behind things. So I was a biological anthropology research assistant, as well as actually for the eating disorders part, I was a research assistant in a couple of courses and a TA teaching assistant as well in grief and loss, and then also attachment disorders with kids and their caregivers. So that was my undergrad experience. And then once I was getting towards the end of my time at Iowa, I had some decisions to make, and I decided that going into getting my clinical mental health counseling degree was going to be the right path for me in order to kind of hit all of those things that are interests from the biological standpoint as well as a sociological standpoint, and then also just helping people live essentially their best lives. So that's the short version of my journey. And then I have, before I opened my practice in 2010, which I need to have my office manager update my website, because I've actually been practicing since 2003. So that's like, yikes, that's like 17 years, which is crazy. But before doing my private practice in Schaumburg, I had stints at Alexian Brothers Behavioral Health Hospital as a chemical dependency therapist. I've had positions at therapeutic day schools, residential treatment centers. So it's really kind of run the gamut, if you will. But when I decided to open my business, eating disorders was always a passion of mine. And I would also float at Alexian Brothers on their eating disorder unit. So it's just a very fascinating mental health issue / disorder. And I think that as difficult and challenging as it can be, it's really, really interesting, fascinating. And when you're doing good work with clients, you can see such a vast improvement in just their general well-being, which is an awesome goal to have. So we really really have gotten more into the eating disorder area of things because it seems to be a pretty prevalent issue. So yeah, I take my background from both, personal and professional experiences, kind of where it's brought me. We kind of sometimes fall into certain things. And I think when I was in undergrad, I just happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right professors that were great mentors, and just found a fascination with therapy and mental health in general. So yeah, so that's kind of my brief journey, because I could probably talk for hours on it.
Now, I know today we're going to be diving a lot into eating disorders, but before we do that, tell us more about what you're doing in your private practice. I know it's called Meghan L, Reitz and Associates, so there's more than just you, but what kinds of things are you helping your clients with? Tell us all the things.
So I own Meghan L, Reitz and Associates. It's a mental health outpatient private practice in Schaumburg. So there's myself, and then we have two other therapists at this time. One is actually bilingual in Spanish as well. So we do some general stuff like depression, anxiety, life transitions, those kinds of things. We work with individuals, age is 5 on up. I'd say that our oldest client has been in their 90s, so it really ranges. We do not only the individual piece, but we do family therapy and then also couples therapy. So that's a big thing for us as well, is working with couples, especially with like infidelity and parenting. So that's a biggie too in our world. I'd say in terms of like quote unquote specializations between the three therapists, definitely eating disorders. Anna is certified as a family-based therapist in eating disorders. And we also do a lot of work with trauma and, helping process that, getting people to a better place, as well as being able to use coping skills and work on their distress tolerance and overall emotional regulation. Then they'll be a little bit more successful in their relationships and life in general. And then a big piece that we also work with are children and adolescents that have behavioral health issues, such as just, like ADHD, behavioral emotional components that we usually work with the school districts around the area and try to provide some outpatient support to the teacher, the family, social workers, school psychologists, and really try to take a holistic team approach to the child's care. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do. Occasionally we do offer groups. I have had groups, especially for adolescent females who were dealing with body image issues. And then we've also had grief and loss groups. So they pop up depending on the need of our population, the demographic that presents itself, and then what our current clients are looking for in terms of services. So yeah, that's what we do, kind of in a short kind of, quick description, if you will.
Yeah, I love that. So, Meghan, it sounds to me like, hey, your office, it has specialties, but it's also pretty diverse in its skill set and in its area of expertise. What is it about, eating disorders in particular that kind of allowed you to say, hey, this is the road that I want to go down to, really discuss this more with my clients and the people that I'm working with as an area of expertise for yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to, give the caveat of the words eating disorder really is a spectrum, right? And I can talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But
yeah, actually that'd be a great starting place. Let's just, start by kind of defining what an eating disorder is, or what the definition is, and then we can kind of get into your personal interest with it.
Okay, that sounds good. So what I usually like to tell people in like layman's terms is that it really presents itself as an unhealthy relationship with food, body image, weight. Again, that's a very shortened version of the definition. But when I look at it and I try to explain that to clients too, because sometimes they may not even be aware that there's some disordered eating or unhealthy relationships with that kind of thing, is just really being able to, note that, is it impairing your physical health and as well as your mental health? How much are you perseverating on calories, on, how you look. We talk about like checking in the mirror frequently, being very, very hyper focused on food, especially what we would call bad foods. We also really be watchful of the weighing yourself frequently. That's also not helpful. But with that is a lot of people will come in maybe for depression, anxiety, and then when you start to peel away the layers, you can see that maybe there's some other things going on. And what I see, especially in the eating disorder world, is that it's definitely comorbid. And what that means is it usually is going hand in hand with some other kind of issue. And so oftentimes you'll see, like, if someone has OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, most certainly trauma is a biggie. So that eating disorders can stem from past traumas as a coping mechanism. And then also, when we're talking about comorbid kinds of things, the other two issues that come to mind are just general PTSD as well as alcoholism. So that's a whole area that's really been taking off in terms of research and how those go together, as well as self-injury. So to put that succinctly is that when I have a client sitting in front of me, I mean, we're obviously assessing for all of those issues, but one of my, initial questions is pertaining to, what does your lifestyle look like? Give me a sense of, what your diet is like. And let me be clear, diet means what we eat. It does not mean diet does not equal losing weight. So I like to also clarify that to people. What does your sleep look like? Are you preoccupied with how you look, your body image? Are you feeling very insecure, self-conscious? And then really diving into, if there's yeses to those, then diving a little further into, what is your relationship with food? Are you finding yourself restricting? Are you really feeling a lot of guilt and shame after eating certain things? So that just gives me an extra piece of information working with people, because as you know, I mean, we're all, we have a spectrum, wide array of things that we bring to the table, not just one thing. So you have to attend to the whole person.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You bring up something that kind of triggered a thought in my head that I'd never had before. But the idea, you brought up alcoholism and how, part of an eating disorder may be using food as a coping mechanism. I mean, pardon my ignorance, maybe I'm way off on this, but would you consider alcoholism then to be an eating disorder?
That's a really good question. Charlie, that was really good. So yes and no. So I know it's kind of like not one of those things where it's black and white. What I have found, at least in my experience, and then I can speak a little bit more to what's going on with research, is that trying to tease out maybe it's like the chicken or the egg, if you will. What I've found, though, is especially people that come to the table with a diagnosis of anorexia, so that's very restrictive of the calories, as also extreme exercising, those individuals will often compensate a bit with caloric intake through alcohol. And so then a dependency will tend to start, especially too, the effects of alcohol on someone who's not getting proper nutrition is going to be pretty significant. So I don't want to say it's lumped in there with it. And then according to my guidelines with the diagnostic manuals in psychology and psychiatry, is that they are considered separate diagnoses. But again, there's a blending. Now, with that being said, there is continuing research going on as to what does all that mean? Because it's something that you're consuming, right? And so what exactly does that mean? Because I would say probably like 90% I say, like at my practice, that alcoholism goes hand in hand with some kind of an eating disorder, especially with anorexia. So I guess to answer your question, it's a yes and no. There's no black and white answer in that they're recognizing that as something part of an eating disorder, but it certainly is something I think that is ever evolving.
Now, Meghan, you started off the conversation with like, what is an eating disorder, as describing it as a spectrum. And to my, very shallow knowledge of eating disorders is that I think I know names of two, which is anorexia and bulimia. And I'm sure there's a million more, and a spectrum of grays and whites in between all of those. Could you walk us through some of those, like maybe some of the names of common eating disorders, but also what do you mean by a spectrum? Because I kind of see it, if there's names, there must be categories. But when you say spectrum, I kind of see, a spectrum. Like you could be on your way to this way, or slight disorder here or there. Walk us through that if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, where this gets a little complicated. Definitely helpful to narrow down what you're working with, because you're absolutely right, Julie, is that some people will just have, like a touch of maybe some body image stuff. Doesn't mean that they have a full-blown eating disorder, but, it can run the gamut. I mean, we get to people too that are so severely malnourished, they're at the risk of dying. So to your question, there are a vast number of eating disorder diagnosis codes and names, but I'll give you guys a few just for listeners, education. So there's obviously anorexia nervosa. There's bulimia. So those are the two biggies that people know. The other one is binge eating disorder. That's usually marked with, typically at night, individuals will do just what it sounds like, binge on food, usually till they're sick. And then there's a lot of guilt and shame that goes on right after that. Those are not purging, meaning they're not throwing up after eating. That's bulimia. So there's the binge eating part, which again, eating disorders do not just mean when you think of someone that has anorexia and is underweight, you can also have someone that is overweight. So that often goes with the binge eating disorders. The other ones of note, body dysmorphic disorder. So essentially like looking in the mirror and you do not see what's really there. I think that you think of yourself as either unattractive, aesthetically displeasing, having a lot of flaws, when in reality, that's actually very far from the truth. That can be also coinciding with some things like anorexia, where someone looks in the mirror, they see someone that's overweight, yet they're actually underweight. And then a couple more, there's avoidant and restrictive food disorders. So we sometimes see that with younger kids, but that is more of a product of, with kids, they can be picky with stuff. And so we assess too, are there other medical issues that are going on that are causing our kiddos to, they're not restricting on purpose, essentially. And then there's also two more, and I won't get too much into them, but they often are not talked about. One is called pica, and that's actually people who eat things that are not food. And so that could be objects or dirt or safety pins, so that's a whole other area. And then the other one that I like to mention too is called rumination disorder. So the word rumination, it's like when a cow is eating grass, right? So it keeps chewing it and all that. So same thing with someone who has a rumination disorder, is that they're constantly chewing their food and essentially, I don't want to sound gross, but regurgitating it and then chewing it again. So those are the main ones.
Do you find, I guess it's just my perception, but I'm not in the field, do you find that the majority of people who are affected by eating disorders are female, or is it actually more of an even split than maybe the general public would be led to believe?
Yes, so great question. And I think that also lends itself to mention that there needs to be a vast shift in how research is being done, because there's a lot of different stats out there. I try to stick with the main players out there, like the National Association for Eating Disorders and ANAD, which is anorexia nervosa and associated disorders, for my information. So yes, in short. So usually teens and females in their 20s have a higher rate of having eating disorders. About 30 million people in the US suffer from eating disorders. And like I said, teens and 20-somethings usually are more so. But we've seen kids as young as 6 come into our office as old as 76. So it can be a much larger thing than people realize. And I don't know what research is capturing in terms of demographics.
When people have an eating disorder, do they know that they have an eating disorder? Are they aware? Because as you're describing this, I feel like I'm thinking in my head, wow, this individual must be doing that action to cope with something. So it must seem like a good way to cope in their head, or a way to cope. So are people aware that they have an eating disorder usually, or not usually?
I think that it also is a product of just their level of self-awareness. I think that just because there is so much information out there these days, and people have such access to the internet to look up stuff, so I think that more people are aware than not. Now, with that being said, sometimes, like, I think I earlier said, peeling away the layers of the onion. So someone who's a little less self-aware or thinks it's presenting itself as something else, they're not realizing that might be something that they're contending with. And so, it's one of those things too, where individuals that don't have that awareness are they have a very hard time acknowledging and identifying that that's what's going on with them. So there can be a high level of denial, because honestly, there can be a lot of guilt and shame that runs with it, right? So, with that being said, I'd say the majority of people that clearly go and get treatment, they know that there's an issue. And that's one of those things too, with us working with schools, nutritionists, doctors, psychiatrists, so that if there's some, red flags that are coming up, we can try to address that with the person. But it's less likely that a child will be aware. But when you have someone that is in their, adult age, 20s and up, there's typically an awareness that there is a problem. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily want to change that problem.
So what might be some of those red flags that somebody should be aware of, like within themselves? Because I'm thinking, and I guess maybe this is a separate question, or it's a build-on question, but like, at what point does like an eating habit become an eating disorder? And I guess what I'm thinking is like, okay, well, let's say, every night somebody goes, to the pantry and grabs something sweet because that's the way to kind of de-stress from the day. And, okay, it may be a coping mechanism to de-stress, but, it never escalates more than the one thing, but something that they have to do every night, or they feel that they have to do, where's, I'm sure there's not a definitive line, but can you talk about that, and then maybe what some of those early warning signs are that somebody may be trending towards it?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think that, with anything, if you can try to intervene earlier, then that really can be a great stopgap from things, proceeding and rolling forward and getting worse. So some things to just be mindful of, and again, these don't necessarily define everyone, so I want to be clear about that. And if there is a question about what's going on with someone, they definitely need to also see their physician. But to your question, Charlie, so things such as hiding food, wanting to eat where there's no one else around, so that can be oftentimes with binge eating disorder, eating until you're past full, kind of a mindless eating. It's also marked with, like I said before, a ton of shame, guilt, really affects your mood, and usually is a cycle. Using laxatives, so that's another thing where it's like utilizing something that is going to make you lose weight. The other thing too, to be mindful of is when we get into really tight calorie counting, because for some of us, it can be very consuming. And that's a slippery slope if you already have a predisposition to maybe having some kind of an eating disorder. And a lot of times too, with trauma clients, eating disorders are a way for them to control something because they feel out of control in other areas of their lives. So other things would be excessive exercise. So when I say excessive, typically our rule of thumb, depending on the person and what kind of, what they're in, if it's an athlete versus, someone that's a lawyer, it's like, what are their goals for fitness? Because, you need to be mindful of that. But I say to people, you shouldn't be working out more than an hour typically a day, meaning like cardio, like that kind of stuff. And usually to try to give yourself 2 rest days a week. But that doesn't mean you can also do low impact stuff on top of that, like yoga and those kinds of things. Again, catering it to the right, to the person. When we get into that category though, of people doing like going to the gym for hours, every day, or really being preoccupied with it, it's like they're freaking out because they can't get to the gym. Other things are less, on the priority list. You see a shift in a preoccupation with something that's going on there with the body and food. And then the other thing is if there's a lot of conversation that happens where it's surrounded by food. So if they're talking a lot about it, that's something to note. And also too, if they talk about food or weight frequently and categorize foods as good or bad. So then that also gets us into that place where it's like, now we call them fear foods, is that you're getting into a place where you're seeing nutrition and dividing out what's good and bad. And then that definition starts to creep bigger and bigger to what's bad and what's good, to a point where potentially, you're eliminating a ton of things. So, and also too, is we really promote people eating food and not relying on juicing and cleansing a lot. I mean, those things can be fine in conjunction though with getting proper nutrition, where you're actually like chewing your food, having the process of your body eating. And so, those are other things too. You think about fad diets, and if that seems to be what someone's on kind of a roller coaster of, can also be a thing to be watchful of.
Now, you've alluded to some of these, but I would like to ask directly because I think it would be interesting to chat about. But what are the things that get someone started on an eating disorder, or are they just born with it? Is it like childhood experiences? Is it triggers in high school? Because you said teens a lot. Is it social media? I mean, if you look at social media, all you see is food and fitness. Well, at least mine is. And I think that's a little biased.
Depends who you follow.
Yeah, exactly. The other day, Charlie and I were chatting about, he's like, what people do you follow on Instagram? I'm like, well, apparently it's not like Michael Jordan and stuff like you follow. But anyways, so how do people get triggered, I guess, into developing an eating disorder? And are some people more predisposed than others?
So that is a wonderful ask, because family adoption and twin studies do show a genetic link to eating disorders. So that's, something to note. Does that mean that you're destined for an eating disorder? No. But if you have maybe a triggering event, it just raises your potential a tad bit. The other thing is obviously nature versus nurture. So, you could be in a very healthy, nurturing environment, and even if you have maybe a slight predisposition for anything, you could, bypass that. But if you are growing up in a family maybe where they're very focused on weight and body image and calories and, those kinds of things that come to mind, particularly when we talk about teens, are sports like wrestling. I've seen quite a few males that have come in because they're trying to make weight. And so that is a little bit of a slippery slope of how you navigate that. And also too, with social media, it's a double-edged sword, right? There's some great stuff out there, and I try to put out in my content positive things because there are such a culture of a diet culture, if you will, and always kind of like, what's the next quick thing that's going to make you lose weight? And then because you lose weight, you're going to be so happy and your life is going to be perfect, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's, you guys probably know better than anyone, is like, that's not sustainable. That's not a maintainable life. And it also doesn't sound like a very good, happy life. And you do get into that territory where it can be really detrimental to your health, actually, and kind of go the opposite way. Our adolescents, and this goes for females, males, and transgender, and especially too, as more research is coming out with transgender individuals, is that they're seeing a higher rate of eating disorders with them. There's definitely a preoccupation with body image across the board with adolescents. I think also too, because of the advent of all of the social media and the, it's like they're getting also exposed to, a general culture of individuals out there, celebrities touting all these quick fixes and what you should look like, that, really gives kids and teens the message that this is what you're supposed to to strive for or attain, when we all know that that's not reality. Even those pictures that people put up often are, airbrushed and, photoshopped. Do they really look like that in person? So, I think it's, to go back originally to my answer, is, it's a combination of things. And it can be as simple, honestly, as, someone going down a path of, their girlfriends talking, slippery slope, talking about weight, and then, going down a path where it's like, okay, I'm going to start counting calories. Okay, I'm going to start restricting. I'm going to start eliminating certain foods from my diet. And so that can also be fostered by a little bit of a group mentality, unfortunately. So I hopefully that kind of answered your question. But yeah, so there can definitely be genetic components, but then there's also what's going on in the environment that needs to be paid attention to.
Now, is it just calories that's the issue, or could it be like, okay, I'm not going to eat anything processed, like nothing that's not pure will enter my body, and just like super strict on that? Could that be, or is that like a sign of somebody that's actually, trying to be really healthy? Like where does that line get drawn?
Yeah. So, and I know that kind of gets into that sticky territory where that might be a little bit more individualized. So if you have someone that's very militant in, you can do what you need to do for yourself, but if you're, trying to push that on other people, you get into that kind of space, because sometimes, medically people can't, be doing certain things that others can or want to do. Now, to answer what you're asking, is that no, that does not necessarily mean that you have an eating disorder. And we know that there's a lot of evidence that eating things that are not processed are healthier for you. So that's fine. I think it's more when you get into that territory of eliminating complete food groups, meaning they're, I'm not going to have any fat. I'm only going to eat vegetables and fruit. That's it. You might be lacking in protein, fiber, those kinds of things. So when we talk about, like, if you're vegan or vegetarian, that doesn't mean that you have an eating disorder. You've made a choice to, as long as you're getting the nutrients that you need, then awesome. That shouldn't be an issue. But then that does get into that area as well as, do you have a preoccupation with how you look on the outside, and where does that fall in the continuum? So really, I think that a big thing is how consuming are these thoughts, and how much does it interfere with your life? So, I think that that's also kind of a every individual is unique, and that kind of has to be assessed, individually. But yeah, to answer your question, no, that does not necessarily mean you've got a problem.
And that totally makes sense. I think that's a fantastic answer. And so talk to us about like when a client comes to see you, what does a session with you look like? How might a plan be put together to try to help somebody, work through an eating disorder that they may be experiencing?
Yes, definitely. So typically there's two things that we do. So one is if we've got a child or a teen, we attend to them with what's called family-based therapy for eating disorders. And what that essentially means is that it's a course of 15 sessions, and the therapist works with not only the client, but the family unit. And so we actually will have meals at the office. We set up where we will make the food together and sit down, and the therapist is involved so that we can help coach with what's going on there. So that's, a very brief piece of that, but essentially we look at, especially with kids and teens, they need to have everyone on board. Now, if I have an adult that comes in, what I tend to is what's called acceptance commitment therapy, and that's ACT or ACT. And so what that is really kind of, trying to work on letting go of some of the control that is an illusion, right? And so there's some strategies that we use with that. Now, when someone comes into my office initially, we obviously do an intake to assess like what's going on, what kind of background they have, what they're bringing to the table. But what my usual first and foremost go-to is getting them to give me written permission to speak with and coordinate with their healthcare providers. So, and if they don't have that, and depending on the severity of what's going on, I have resources for nutritionists that I work with that also work with eating disorders, which is fabulous. And I've actually worked with personal trainers because, there is that component. It's like, you still need to be fit. And so it's hard because it's like finding that balance between you still need to eat, you still need to exercise, but we don't want it to become extreme, and so that's why it's important to have all of those facets working with me to come up with a game plan. I also have people get a physical from their PCP, their primary care doctor, just to make sure there's nothing else going on. And then if they have a psychiatrist, how we're managing medications, those kinds of things. So we do the coordination, and then what I usually do is I come up with a treatment plan and essentially like, what are our goals? What do we want to try to work on? And then the client and I will sit and look through, okay, what kinds of steps would be manageable and doable? And usually they're baby steps, right? This isn't something that's going to typically change overnight. And so we give tiny little milestones. And again, going back to the family-based therapy, depending on what's going on with that adult client, we may invite their significant other, or if there's other people in the household, to also do essentially like a mock dinner or lunch to practice and also encourage some safety for the client and being at the dinner table. So, we get creative for sure. And then the other thing is, just to throw this out there, so when we have individuals that are more on the severe end of anorexia, we're definitely in touch with their health care team, but sometimes we need to watch their weight and see if they're, gaining or losing. And we do what's called blind weights, so the person does not see how much they weigh. And so when we coordinate with nutritionists, personal trainers, doctors, we do what's called blind weights, because you don't want it to be a triggering source, because they can then walk away really hyper focusing on that number. And when we get into more of the binge eating or, people that are in the obesity category, that's a little bit different, because we do need to be mindful of, where the weight is. But I would say for our main, like anorexia and bulimia, we tend to go more towards that.
Thank you very much for sharing your time, your expertise, your stories with us. I mean, this was wonderful. This is really valuable information, because like the stats you were sharing, I mean, look, this is a very prevalent issue. And, the earlier that it can be identified, the earlier that the red flags can be noticed, the earlier that something can be done about it. And like you're saying, I had no idea that this was the number one, I don't want to say killer, but the number one thing that results in death from a psychological issue. I never would have guessed that. So it's a huge thing. And so, yeah, if people can identify this earlier, can connect with professionals like yourself and to get the help that they need, I mean, that would just be tremendous. So thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. So unfortunately, the recording that we were doing with Meghan got cut short. We kept talking. Unbeknownst to us, the recording actually stopped. So we missed the last 10 minutes of our conversation with Meghan. But to learn more about Meghan, to connect with her and see if you may be a good fit for her services, check out SchaumburgCounselor.com. That's SCHAUMBURG counselor.com. You can also find the links there to follow her on Facebook, follow her on Instagram, follow her on Twitter, and connect with her on LinkedIn. If you want to search her on Facebook, look up Meghan L. Reitz and Associates, and on Instagram, it's MLRA Counseling. So connect with Meghan, give her a follow, learn more about the work that she is doing with all of her clients as well as in the space of eating disorders. And if you'd like to learn more about her services, be sure to reach out to her. Again, you can find her website at SchaumburgCounselor.com. So that episode was jam-packed with great information that may or may not be applicable to you, may or may not be applicable to somebody that you know. But if it is, please share this episode with them because it can help so many people who are in need of the guidance and support that Meghan and her colleagues can offer. And while you're online, if you wouldn't mind, head on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find this episode and find this podcast when they are looking for information on exercise and when they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us that 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.